You don't belong here." Victoria Caldwell's voice cut through the entire restaurant like a blade. She lifted the dessert plate and pushed it back toward the waitress without looking at her. "I said creme brulee. This is panna cotta. Do you even know the difference, or is reading menus too complicated for someone like you?" The room went still. Every guest at every table turned to look, and Elena Marquez stood there holding that plate in a silence so sharp it could draw blood. Gushel. If you've ever watched someone be humiliated in public and felt your chest tighten because you knew exactly what that felt like, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The restaurant was called Aurelius. It sat on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, and on a clear night you could see 3 bridges from the window tables. The kind of place where the menu had no prices, because the people who ate there never needed to ask. Where the lighting was warm enough to make everyone look important, and the silence between courses felt deliberate, like part of the experience. Elena Marquez had worked there for 11 months. She knew which guests tipped quietly, and which ones made a point of it. She knew which regulars wanted their coffee before they asked, and which bottles the sommelier pushed hardest on Tuesday nights. She knew the weight of a tray at the end of a double shift, the particular ache in the arch of her foot from standing on marble floors for 8 hours straight, and the exact expression a person wore right before they decided you were invisible. She had learned to keep her face neutral when that happened. She had learned patience the way other people learned languages slowly, painfully, until it became something she could use without thinking about it. She was 29 years old. She was 5'4". She wore her dark hair pulled back because the dress code required it. She had no jewelry except a thin silver ring on her right hand that she never talked about. For 11 months, she had carried plates, refilled glasses, memorized orders, and said thank you to people who looked straight through her. And for 11 months, she had watched. She had watched the way Damian Romano sat at the corner table every third Friday. The way he always faced the door. The way his eyes moved across the room before he picked up the menu, cataloging every person present before he allowed himself to relax even slightly. She had watched the men who sat with him, always 2 to his left, always one standing near the service hall, and she had watched the way those men watched everything else. She had watched, and she had waited. And she had told herself that tonight was not the night. That she needed more time. That she needed to be certain before she did anything that could not be undone. And then Victoria Caldwell pushed that plate across the table, and everything changed. "I'm so sorry," Elena said. Her voice came out steady. "Let me get that corrected for you right away." Victoria did not accept the apology. That was the thing about Victoria Caldwell. She was not actually interested in the dessert. She had barely touched her entree. She ordered things at restaurants the way some people collected objects not to use them, but to confirm they had the right to possess them. "Don't apologize," Victoria said. "Just explain to me how this keeps happening. I have been here 4 times in the last 2 months, and every single time someone on your staff makes a mistake. I understand your frustration, and I don't think you do understand." Victoria turned in her chair, so she was fully facing Elena now. The diamond on her engagement ring caught the candlelight and threw tiny fragments of brightness across the tablecloth. "You understand what it's like to carry a plate. You don't understand what it's like to sit down for a dinner you've been planning for 3 weeks and have the entire experience ruined by carelessness." Elena looked at her. She did not look down. That was the first thing Damian Romano noticed. He was sitting 2 feet away from his fiancée, and he had been half present for most of the evening. His attention divided between the conversation at the table and the quiet calculations that never really stopped running in the back of his mind. But when Victoria started in on the waitress, something made him pay attention. Most people, when Victoria turned that focus on them, looked for a way to shrink. They apologized again. They offered something extra. They retreated as quickly as possible. It was the reasonable response. Victoria came from money, and she was going to marry into a kind of power that most people in the city preferred not to think about too directly. Starting a conflict with her was not a rational choice. But this waitress was looking at his fiancée with an expression that Damien could not immediately categorize. It was not defiance. It was not fear. It was something closer to patience. Like someone who had practiced this exact moment and had decided in advance not to rush it. "The mistake was mine," Elena said. "I'll replace the dessert at no charge and make sure the rest of your evening is at no charge." Victoria laughed, and it was the kind of laugh designed to make someone feel small. "Do you know how much my fiancé spends here every month? At no charge means absolutely nothing to me. What would mean something is if you people hired staff who could do a basic job without embarrassing themselves." One of the men at the neighboring table shifted in his chair. Across the room, the maitre d' had become very still. "Your appearance," Victoria continued, looking Elena up and down in a way that was deliberate and slow. "Your manner, the way you carry yourself, you look like you've never been anywhere nicer than a diner. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because maybe this kind of environment isn't the right fit for you." Elena was quiet for a moment. Just one moment. Long enough for Victoria to think she had won. And then Elena said very calmly, "Do you know the difference between being respected and being feared?" The table went silent. Victoria's expression shifted, something moving behind her eyes, something between confusion and the first edge of anger. "Excuse me. People in this room are quiet because they're afraid of making things worse," Elena said. "Not because they respect the situation. There's a difference, and I think most people here can tell you understand one of those things very well." Nobody moved. Victoria's jaw tightened. The color in her cheeks changed. And Damien Romano set down his wineglass very slowly and looked at the waitress for the first time. Not the way he usually looked at restaurant staff, that automatic background awareness that registered their presence without focusing on it. He looked at her. "Victoria," he said. His voice was quiet. That was one of the things people didn't expect about Damien Romano the first time they met him. They expected someone louder, someone who performed power in a way you could see and recognize. Instead, he was soft-spoken, almost to the point of being hard to hear, and somehow that made everything he said land with more weight than if he'd shouted. "That's enough," he said. Victoria turned to him. "Damien, I said that's enough." He picked up his wine glass again. Victoria pressed her lips together, and Elena excused herself and walked toward the kitchen. She did not hurry. She kept her back straight and her steps even, and she did not look back once. In the kitchen, she stood at the prep counter and breathed. One of the line cooks glanced at her. Miguel had worked at Aurelius for 6 years, and he had the particular immunity of someone who had witnessed enough that almost nothing surprised him anymore. He looked at her face and said, "How bad?" "Manageable," Elena said. "You need to talk to Marcus." Marcus was the floor manager, a thin, nervous man who believed strongly in conflict avoidance as a management philosophy. "No," Elena said. "I'm fine." "She's Romano's girl," Miguel said. "I know who she is." "That makes it complicated." "Everything is complicated," Elena said. She picked up the replacement dessert that had already been prepared because she had told the kitchen 5 minutes ago that a replacement might be needed before Victoria had even started, because she had been watching this table all evening, and she had seen where it was going, and she turned back toward the floor. Miguel watched her go. He had worked with a lot of waitstaff over the years. Most of them you could read pretty clearly. Elena Marquez, he had never been able to read. He had stopped trying after the 3rd month. When Elena returned to the table with the correct dessert, Victoria did not acknowledge her. Damien watched her set the plate down. "Thank you," he said. Elena looked at him briefly. "Of course. Let me know if there's anything else you need." She was turning to leave when Damien said, "What's your name?" Elena stopped. "Elena," she said. He nodded once. "How long have you worked here, Elena?" "Almost a year." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "You're good at your job." It was a strange thing to say under the circumstances. Victoria made a small sound that wasn't quite anything identifiable. "Thank you," Elena said again. And she left. She spent the rest of the shift aware of exactly where Damien Romano was in the room at all times. Not because she was afraid of him, because she had spent 11 months getting to this point, and she could not afford to make a mistake now. She had chosen Aurelius with care. It was Romano territory in the way that certain blocks of this city were Romano territory, not owned exactly, but claimed in a way that everyone understood without it needing to be written down anywhere. Damien Romano ate here because it was a place where he had history, where the staff knew him, without being close to him, where he could conduct certain kinds of conversations in the open air, without worrying about who was listening. Elena had understood from the beginning that working here meant she would eventually be in the same room as Damien Romano. She had not expected it would take 11 months. She had not expected patience to be the most important skill she would need. But she had learned patience before she learned almost anything else. So, her grandfather used to say that waiting was not the same as doing nothing. Anyone can move fast, Mateo Marquez had told her when she was 8 years old and furious about something she couldn't even remember now. Moving fast means other people see you coming. Real power is patience. Real power is standing still long enough that the world shows you its weaknesses before you move. She hadn't understood then. She understood now. Mateo Marquez had been a careful man, deliberate in the way he spoke. Deliberate in the way he made decisions, deliberate in the way he loved the people he loved. He was not a violent man, though he had moved in circles where violence was a standard language. He was the kind of man who solved problems by understanding them so thoroughly that the problems eventually unmade themselves. Until the day a problem came that was too large to unmake. Elena was 12 when she lost him, not lost in the way of a funeral with flowers and a grave to visit. Lost in the way of a door that closes so completely you can't even find the frame anymore. There one morning, and simply absent by afternoon, the way her grandmother described it, her voice flat and careful even decades later. The official version was that Mateo Marquez had died in a car accident on a road outside the city. The official version was a lie. Elena knew this because her grandmother had told her the year Elena turned 18, sitting across from her at a kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold between them. She had laid it out without drama, without grief. She had already finished grieving long before the way you'd explain something that was true, regardless of whether you liked it. Mateo Marquez had discovered something he was not supposed to discover. He had tried to do the right thing with that knowledge, and the people who were threatened by his integrity had decided it was easier to make him disappear than to let him keep talking. Who? Elena had asked. Her grandmother had looked at her for a long moment. Powerful people, rich people, the kind of people who make decisions in rooms you'll never be invited into. That's not specific enough. No. Her grandmother agreed. It isn't. And she had pushed a small envelope across the table. Inside was a single card with a name on it, and below the name, one sentence in her grandfather's handwriting. When the time comes, find the Romano family. Only then will the truth survive. The Romano family. Elena had spent 5 years after that learning everything she could about them, not reading newspaper articles. Those were too clean, too distant, already filtered through whatever version of the story somebody had decided to allow. She learned by listening. She found people who had been adjacent to that world, and she asked careful questions over long periods of time. She took a job in accounting that had nothing to do with any of this, and she paid her bills, and she built a life that looked from the outside like a perfectly ordinary life. And she thought about what her grandfather had meant. Find the Romano family. Not confront them. Not expose them. Find them. As if the Romano family were a destination rather than a target. As if there were something to be located there rather than something to be accused. It took her a long time to understand the distinction. The Romano family, as it turned out, was not a single thing. There was the elder Romano Damien's father, Carlo Romano, who had died 4 years ago of a heart attack at the age of 67, and who, in the years before his death, had quietly and systematically cut his organization away from certain partnerships that had previously been considered untouchable. And there was Damien, who had taken over at 32 and spent the following decade making decisions that baffled the people around him and infuriated the people who had expected to profit from his succession. Damien Romano was not his father. But Elena had come to believe slowly and carefully that he might be capable of becoming what his father had tried to be. She needed to know for certain. The restaurant began to empty around 10:30. The Romano table was one of the last. Victoria was on her phone, her attention thoroughly divorced from the evening at this point. One of Damien's men had gone to retrieve the car. The other was standing near the host stand with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to wait without looking like he's waiting. Damien was still at the table. He had ordered an espresso after the dessert, and he was drinking it slowly. Elena was refilling water glasses at a nearby table when he said without looking up from his cup, "You can stop watching me." She paused. "I'm sorry. You've been watching me since before you came to our table." He finally looked at her. His eyes were darker than she had expected and more direct. "Not in an obvious way. But I notice things." Elena set the water pitcher down on the tray she was carrying. "I watch all the tables," she said. "You watch all the tables," he agreed, "but you watch this one differently." She did not respond to that. Damien tilted his head slightly. It was a small motion, evaluative. "How long have you worked here?" "You already asked me that." "Humor me." 11 months. "Where before this?" "Different restaurants, different cities." All of it true. She had been very careful to make sure the things she said were always true. Truth was harder to disprove. "Family in New York?" "No." He was quiet for a moment. The espresso cup was nearly empty. "You weren't afraid of Victoria tonight." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." He put the cup down. "Most people, when she does that, they go somewhere inside themselves where it's easier to absorb the hit. You didn't go anywhere. You stayed right there." Elena looked at him. She thought about the card in her grandfather's handwriting. She thought about 11 months of carrying plates and refilling glasses and watching this man from a careful distance, trying to determine whether he was someone worth trusting. "Some things," she said, "you practice until they stop feeling like a choice." Damien Romano looked at her for a long moment. And then very quietly he said, "What's your last name?" The question landed differently than the others, because of the way he asked it. Not the way you asked a waitress her last name. The way you asked a question when you already suspected the answer was going to rearrange something. "Marquez," Elena said. The change in his expression was small, but Elena had spent 11 months learning to watch for small things. She saw it. "Thank you for the service tonight," Damien said. His voice had shifted slightly, still quiet, still controlled, but something underneath it had tightened. "Everything was excellent." He stood. Victoria materialized at his elbow without seeming to notice the texture of what had just happened between them. She tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and said something about the car being ready. Damien let her lead him toward the door. At the entrance, he paused. He turned back. He looked at Elena across the length of the restaurant, all those empty tables, all that warm light, all that expensive silence, and he looked at her for just long enough that it meant something. Then he walked out. Elena stood there. The maitre d' came by to let her know she could begin the closing checklist. She said yes, and she started moving through her tasks, and she kept her breathing even and her face neutral. Her heart was not neutral. Her heart was doing something complicated and rapid that she controlled through the same discipline she applied to everything else, through the understanding that feeling. Something did not mean you had to show it, that emotion was information, not instruction. He had recognized her name, or not her name exactly, but something in her name had moved through him like a current, and she had seen it. which meant her grandfather had been right, and which meant that tonight, for the first time in 11 months, she had stopped waiting. Yeah, the thing about Damien Romano that most people understood was his power. The thing most people did not understand was what he had done with it. He had inherited an empire built on fear and leverage, and the particular kind of control that came from knowing where everybody was buried, sometimes, literally. His father had built it from almost nothing over the course of 40 years, starting in the streets of a neighborhood nobody paid attention to, and expanding outward through patience and intelligence, and a ruthlessness he deployed sparingly, because he understood that the threat of something was almost always more useful than the thing itself. Carlo Romano had been dangerous in the specific way of someone who was also principled. That combination made him unpredictable, which made him powerful. When he died, the people who had worked with him and around him had expected Damien to be simpler. Damien had disappointed them. He had taken the empire, and he had started making decisions that his father never made, cutting certain partnerships, walking away from certain income streams, making clear in quiet and unambiguous ways that there were things he would not do, regardless of the profit they represented. The people who worked directly for him had adapted. The people on the periphery had not been happy, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, Damien had gotten engaged to Victoria Caldwell, whose father ran a financial network that interfaced with certain interests that Damien had very carefully not examined too closely. That last part bothered him. It had bothered him for a while. He told himself it was logistics, that the alliance had strategic value, that marriages in his world had always been partly contractual, and there was no particular reason his should be different. He told himself these things on the nights when he woke at 3 a.m. and lay in the dark, and did the math on his own life, and did not entirely like the answer. He told Marcus Hale, his head of security, to look into the waitress before he got in the car that night. Elena Marquez, he said. Marcus, who had been with Damien for 8 years and who had learned to take small requests seriously, wrote it down and said he'd have something by morning. Employment history, Damien said. Background, any family connections, anything unusual in the file. Looking for something specific. Damien thought about her face when he'd said her name, the way she had not reacted. Or rather, the way she had reacted so precisely correctly that it didn't look like a reaction at all. I don't know yet, he said. He got in the car. Victoria talked the whole way home about the restaurant, about the waitress, about the indignity of the evening, about how she'd been patient, but really management needed to address the staff quality issue because it was reflecting badly on Damien. And what did it say about the kind of establishment he chose to frequent when the servers didn't even know the difference between 2 desserts, and she had been embarrassed. She had been genuinely embarrassed in front of people whose opinion mattered. Damien looked out the window. He listened to her. And he thought about what Elena Marquez had said. Do you know the difference between being respected and being feared? He thought about that for a long time after they got home. He thought about it in the way you thought about something that snagged on something else inside you. Something you hadn't known was exposed until you felt the pull. He thought, when was the last time anyone in a room with him had said something that surprised him? He thought, when was the last time he had been surprised? He stood at the window of the apartment for a while, looking at the city. He thought about his father. He thought about a photograph in an old file. He thought about a name. Marcus called at 7 the next morning. Clean record, he said. Everything checks out on the surface. But what? Her references are too clean. Damien said nothing. Not fake, Marcus clarified. I ran them all. Every reference is real. Every employer exists. But it's the kind of clean you get when someone has been very deliberate about what they leave behind. There are gaps, small ones. Nothing that would flag a standard employment check. But if you're looking for them, I'm looking. Then they're there. Damien walked to the window. Same view as last night, different light. Any family. Mother deceased, father unknown. Grandmother, a woman named Rosaria Marquez. Died about 6 years ago in New Jersey. He paused. Marquez, Damien said. Yeah. Was she born Marquez? No, Marcus said. Born Rosaria De Luca. Married name. Her husband was a man named Mateo Marquez. Damien's hand tightened on the phone. Marcus, who was good at reading silence, waited. Find the file on Mateo Marquez, Damien said. Not the official one. I want my father's files. Those are... I know where they are. Find me Mateo Marquez. He hung up, stood there. The city was fully awake now, that particular morning intensity that never stopped being both remarkable and exhausting. The sense of a million things happening simultaneously in directions that had nothing to do with each other. He thought about a conversation his father had had with him once when Damien was 24 and still learning the edges of everything he was going to inherit. His father had taken him to a room in an old building on the west side, a room with boxes of files. The kind of careful record-keeping that certain kinds of men did out of instinct, the knowledge that memory was unreliable and paper endured. Someday, Carlo Romano had said, someone is going to come to you and ask you about something that happened before you were paying attention. When that happens... He had looked at his son for a long moment. I want you to listen. Just that. I want you to listen. Damien had thought at 24 that it was a strange piece of advice. His father was not usually oblique. Standing at the window now at 38, looking at a city that had never stopped asking things of him, he thought he was finally beginning to understand what his father had meant. At Aurelius, the morning shift was starting. Elena arrived at 10 for the prep work, as she did every Tuesday. She knew without any particular evidence to confirm it that Damien Romano had already looked into her. She knew because it was what she would have done. And she knew because she understood him well enough, after 11 months of careful observation, to know that he was not the kind of man who let things go unexamined. She changed into her uniform. She pulled her hair back. She tied on her apron. She thought about her grandfather who had told her that real power was patience, and she thought, all right. Now we begin. She pushed through the kitchen door and went to work. Marcus Hale had been in difficult rooms his entire adult life. He had stood in warehouses at 2 a.m. while men argued about money that didn't exist on paper. He had delivered news that made grown men sit down suddenly, like their legs had simply stopped working. He had learned over 8 years at Damien Romano's side to read the temperature of a situation before he walked into it, to calibrate what he said and how he said it to match the exact emotional weather of the moment. He had never once seen Damien Romano look the way he looked when Marcus handed him the folder. Not alarmed, not angry. Still. The kind of still that Damien reserved for things that mattered more than he wanted them to. Where did you find it? Damien asked. Third box, Marcus said. Your father's files from the early 90s. It was between 2 other folders, no label. If you weren't looking for it specifically, you'd have passed right over it. Damien opened the folder. Inside was a single photograph, a handwritten letter on paper that had yellowed at the edges, and a folded document that Marcus had not opened because there were still things he understood were not his business. Damien looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. Marcus watched him. The woman in the photo, Damien said finally. Who is she? I don't know. There's no name on it. She looks... Damien stopped. Marcus waited. She looks like the waitress, Damien said. It was not a question. Marcus had noticed the same thing when he pulled the photo. He had sat in his car outside the archive building for several minutes before driving back, turning it over in his hands, telling himself he was wrong, telling himself resemblances were common, telling himself this was the kind of pattern matching that led investigators to wrong conclusions. But he had not been able to talk himself out of it entirely. I thought the same thing, Marcus said. But the photo is probably 35-40 years old. If the woman in it is who I think... Rosaria Marquez, Damien said. Then she would have been in her early 20s, which makes the timeline fit for a granddaughter. Damien set the photograph down. He unfolded the letter. Marcus did not read over his shoulder. He had enough professional self-preservation to understand that some things you waited to be told. The room was quiet for a long time. When Damien finished reading, he set the letter down next to the photograph and sat back in his chair. His face was the face of a man doing very fast math in very still water. "My father knew him," Damien said. "Mateo Marquez. He knew him well. Better than I ever knew he knew anyone outside the organization." A pause. "He trusted him." Marcus said nothing. "He writes about him like he trusted him more than most of the men who worked for him directly." Damien's voice had a quality Marcus recognized, the particular flatness that meant something had hit close enough to require extra control. "He says Mateo came to him with evidence. About people they both knew. About things that were happening inside a network that touched both their worlds." "What kind of evidence?" "He doesn't specify. Not in this letter." Damien tapped the folded document. "But he says it's in here. And he says he kept it because he believed someday someone would need it." He looked at Marcus. "He wrote this letter 4 months before he died." Marcus absorbed that. "He knew he was sick," Damien said. "He knew he was running out of time, and instead of giving this to me directly, he left it in a box of archived files where only someone who was specifically looking would find it." He was quiet for a moment. "Because he thought if he gave it to me directly, I'd become a target before I was ready." "Or," Marcus said carefully, "he thought someone else would come looking for it first. And he wanted you to find it around the same time they arrived." Damien looked at him. "Elena Marquez has been working at Aurelius for 11 months, Marcus said. "Your father died 14 months ago." The silence that followed had weight. Damien picked up the photograph again. He looked at the woman in it, young, dark-haired, with a particular quality of stillness in her posture that he recognized because he had seen it last night across a restaurant in a woman holding a plate and choosing not to break. "She came 3 months after the funeral," Damien said. "She gave him enough time to be buried before she started watching his son." "That's one reading." "What's the other reading?" Marcus paused. "That she didn't come until she felt safe enough. That she spent 3 months after the funeral trying to figure out if you were someone she could trust. And then she decided the only way to know for certain was to be in the same room as you." He met Damien's eyes. "And then she spent 11 more months making the same determination." Damien set the photograph down. He was quiet for a long moment. "Set up a meeting," he said. "With Marquez?" "Yes." "Where?" "Not the restaurant." He thought for a moment. "There's a place on 54th, private dining. Tell her—" He stopped. "No, don't tell her anything. I'll go to the restaurant tonight. Victoria has the gallery event tonight. She was expecting you." "I know what Victoria was expecting." Marcus waited. "I'll handle Victoria," Damien said. "I need you to make sure that tonight there's no one watching the restaurant that isn't mine." Marcus understood what that meant. "You think someone else is watching her?" "I think if my father hid something for 14 years, and a young woman spent 11 months in the same building as me before making a move, then whatever is in that document is worth protecting very carefully." He picked up the folded paper. "And I think we are not the only people who have been paying attention." Elena knew something had shifted before she saw him. She felt it the way you felt weather changing, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the particular quality of the air, the way a room holds itself differently when something is about to happen. She was clearing a table near the window when the door opened. Damien Romano walked in alone. No Victoria. No men flanking him at a polite distance. One man outside, she noticed, but inside just Damien in a dark jacket at 7:15 on a Tuesday night for a reservation she had not seen on the books. The maitre d' greeted him and led him to the corner table. The corner table. His table. Elena finished clearing the setting in front of her and moved back toward the service station, and she did not look at him, and she breathed carefully, and she thought, "This is it. This is why you waited." Marcus materialized from somewhere she hadn't seen him come in and spoke briefly to the maitre d'. She couldn't hear what was said. The maitre d' nodded and gestured toward the section, and then he looked at Elena. "Mr. Romano has requested you as his server tonight." The maitre d' said quietly enough that it didn't carry. Elena looked at him. "Of course," she said. "Merci beaucoup." She approached the table the way she always approached it, steady, unhurried, with the professional composure that 11 months of practice had made automatic. "Good evening," she said. "Can I start you with something to drink?" Damien looked up from the menu he wasn't reading. "Water is fine," he said. "Sit down." She went very still. "I beg your pardon. I'm not here for dinner," he said. "I'm here to talk to you. So you can either sit down or we can have this conversation while you stand there pretending to be my waitress, but either way, we're having it." Around them, the other tables were occupied. Normal sounds of a normal evening. Nobody paying attention. Elena looked at the chair across from him. She thought about 11 months of patience. She sat down. Damien looked at her for a moment. Just looked, that direct evaluating look that she had watched from a distance, and now felt up close like a physical thing, like pressure without contact. "My father knew your grandfather," he said. No preamble, no warm-up. Elena kept her hands flat on the table and her expression level. "I know." "How much do you know?" "Enough to come here," she said. "Not enough to know what comes next." "What does that mean?" "It means I know what my grandfather left behind, and I know what he asked for. I don't know if you're the person he thought you'd be." Something moved across Damien's face. Not offense, closer to recognition. "You've been deciding that. For 11 months. "Yes." "And?" She looked at him steadily. "You ended the scene with Victoria last night before I had to." "That's not an answer." "It's part of one." He was quiet for a moment. A couple at a nearby table laughed at something, and the sound was oddly normal against the texture of what was happening here. "What do you have?" Damien asked. "Excuse me?" "Your grandfather left something behind. My father referenced it in a letter. I think you know what it is." Elena looked at him. "Do you have the letter?" "I found it this morning." "And the photograph?" He paused, just fractionally, but she caught it. "Yes, that's my grandmother," Elena said. "She was 23 in that photo. She sat for it the same week she and my grandfather went to your father for help." Damien said nothing. "She told me before she died that your father was the only person in that entire world who listened to what Matteo was trying to tell him. Every other door they went to, politicians, lawyers, people in law enforcement who were supposed to care about these things, every door closed. Your father opened his. My father also watched yours disappear," Damien said. "Your father helped him disappear," Elena said. "There's a difference. And my grandfather understood that difference because the alternative was a grave." The word landed between them. Damien looked at his water glass. He was processing something. She could see the internal calculation behind the controlled exterior, the same thing she had watched from across a dining room for almost a year. "What happened to him?" Damien asked. "The real version." "He was moved, relocated. New name, new city, different country for a while." She paused. "He died 11 years ago in a town in northern Mexico where nobody knew the name Marquez, and nobody knew what he'd spent 40 years carrying." Her voice remained even. "He died safe. That was the best he got." "You were 18 when he died." "Yes." "Did you know him?" "Not really. I knew him as the grandfather I visited twice a year who asked careful questions and listened very carefully to the answers and never talked about himself." She looked at Damien. "I understood why later." Damien was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who else knows you're here?" "No one." "No one." "That was deliberate," she said. "I didn't tell anyone what I was doing because I didn't know when I started whether the Romano family was still worth trusting. If it wasn't, if you turned out to be different from what my grandfather believed, then the fewer people who knew where I was, the safer. And if I turned out to be exactly what my father believed, then I'd still be the only person who knew," she said. Because the people who would want to stop this conversation would only need one loose thread to find it. The weight of that settled visibly on him. He understood what she was saying, because he understood better than most how these things worked, how information moved, how someone with the right connection to the right person could know in 24 hours what you'd said in a private room. "What's in the document?" he asked. "My father's files, the folded paper." "I don't know what version he kept," Elena said. "My grandfather had a copy. He gave it to my grandmother before he disappeared. She kept it hidden for over 30 years, and then she gave it to me." "What is it?" Elena looked at him. This was the moment. She had rehearsed this conversation hundreds of times in the years since her grandmother pressed that envelope across the table. She had imagined every version of it, the version where it went wrong, the version where the person across from her was not what she hoped, the version where she misjudged everything and the 11 months meant nothing. But she had also imagined this version, the version where she looked at the man across from her and saw someone paying attention. "It's a financial record," she said. 40 years old. It documents a network of money movements, legitimate businesses, legal structures, real estate used to launder proceeds from certain operations that involved people who at the time were considered untouchable. "Organized crime," Damien said. "Some, but not only. The significant parts involve people in city government, state government, 2 federal offices." She paused. "And several names that appear in both the government connections and in the private sector, specifically a financial network that interfaces with certain real estate holdings in Lower Manhattan and in the Bronx." She watched his face. She saw the moment he understood. "Victoria's father," he said. The words were very quiet. "Arthur Caldwell's name appears 4 times in the original document," Elena said. "All 4 times in connection with money that moved through a specific set of shell companies between 1981 and 1987. And twice in connection with decisions made about the investigation that was quietly opened and then quietly closed in 1986, the investigation that was supposed to look into the same network and instead disappeared along with my grandfather." Damien said nothing. Elena watched him. She had expected not disbelief exactly, but resistance. The natural response of a person being told something that upended what they thought they knew. She had expected him to push back, to look for the exits in the argument, to protect himself from the implication of what she was saying. Instead, he was doing the thing she had seen him do across a restaurant for almost a year. He was being very, very still and thinking. "He knew," Damien said. "When he arranged the engagement, he wasn't asking her. He was talking to himself, working through something, following a thread back to a point where it connected to other things. She watched it happen. Watched the pieces fall into a new arrangement behind his eyes. "He set it up," Damien said. "Arthur Caldwell. He pushed the engagement because—" He stopped. "Because being connected to you through marriage meant being connected to the Romano organization," Elena said. "And being connected to the Romano organization meant having access to whatever your father might have kept. He thought my father had the document. He's been worried about it for years," Elena said. "That's my belief. The investigation in '86 disappeared, but investigations leave traces. Records. The people involved knew my grandfather had evidence. They dealt with my grandfather. But they never found the evidence itself. And now someone matching your description has been working in my restaurant for almost a year." "I wasn't careful enough," Elena said. "Or I was exactly careful enough, depending on how this goes." Damien looked at her. "You knew you'd be noticed eventually." "I knew you'd notice. I needed you to be the one who noticed first. And if someone else had spotted you before I did, then we wouldn't be having this conversation," she said simply. The matter-of-factness of it seemed to hit him, the understanding that she had walked into this situation knowing exactly how dangerous it was and had decided to do it anyway. "Why?" he asked. "Your grandfather made it out. You have a life. Whatever is in that document is 40 years old. Why come here?" Elena was quiet for a moment. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, about cold tea and paper worn soft from being folded and unfolded over decades. About a man she'd barely known, who had nevertheless shaped the entire architecture of who she was. "Because the people in that document aren't 40 years old," she said. "Arthur Caldwell is 63 years old, and he's been a managing partner at 4 different financial firms since 1987, and none of it traces cleanly back to what he was doing before. Because the network didn't stop when the investigation closed, it adapted. It cleaned itself up. It moved money through different structures." She looked at him steadily. "And because last year a man named David Reyes, a city housing inspector in the Bronx, started asking questions about a specific real estate development. And 3 months later he had a car accident on a road outside the city." The same sentence her grandmother had used, the same words, "a car accident on a road outside the city." Damien's jaw tightened. "It's happening again," Elena said. "The same network, the same playbook 40 years later. And the only thing that's ever been capable of stopping it is sitting in your father's files and in a folder that I have been carrying for 6 years. Damien was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. She had watched him for almost a year, and she had catalogued every expression. The controlled neutrality, the rare edge of amusement, the focused intensity when something in a conversation required his full attention. This was different. This was something she didn't have a name for yet. "Where is the document?" he asked. "Safe," she said. I know what you need," she said, "and I will give it to you, but not tonight, and not here." She leaned forward slightly. "Because I have been careful for 11 months, and I am not going to stop being careful in the last mile." He held her gaze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. And then very quietly, Damien Romano said, "All right." Marcus was outside when Damien emerged 40 minutes later. He fell into step beside him without asking questions. That was one of his best qualities. He understood the difference between the right time for information and the wrong one. They walked half a block before Damien said, "I need everything you have on Arthur Caldwell. Not recent. Go back 40 years. Specifically anything from the mid-'80s. Any connection to a housing or real estate investigation that was opened and closed in 1986. Any connection to anyone named Mateo Marquez." Marcus kept walking. "That's deep." "Yes." "And Caldwell is Victoria's father." Marcus was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "Damien, I know. If this comes back to him, I know what it means." Damien's voice was level. "Do it quietly. Nothing in writing until I say so. And Marcus." He stopped walking. "Nobody outside the 2 of us knows what I just said. Not yet." Marcus looked at him. "You trust the girl?" Damien thought about it. He thought about a woman who had sat across from him and told him a story that could cost her everything, with her hands flat on the table and her voice completely controlled, and had still said, "Not tonight, not here. I'm not going to stop being careful in the last mile." "I trust that she's been more careful than I have," he said. "Right now, that's enough." Genève. Victoria called at 9:45. "You didn't come," she said. Not angry, something more precise than anger. Measuring. "Something came up," Damien said. "The gallery was people were asking for you. My father was asking for you." "I'll call him tomorrow." "Damien." A pause. "Is everything all right?" He was standing at the window again. Same window, same city, different weight on everything he was seeing. "Everything is fine," he said. "I'm sorry about tonight. I'll make it up to you." She accepted it. She always accepted it, which was part of what had always bothered him about the relationship without his being able to name exactly what it was. Victoria accepted things too smoothly. She bent without resistance in the specific way of someone who had learned that patience was a strategy, not a feeling. He had thought before now that was simply who she was. He was reconsidering. After he hung up, he stood there for a while longer. He thought about a letter in his father's handwriting. He thought about a photograph of a woman with a particular stillness to her posture. He thought about a man named Mateo Marquez, who had known the truth about something and had tried to do the right thing with it, and had spent the rest of his life in a country that wasn't his, under a name that wasn't his, because the right thing had cost him everything. He thought about a housing inspector named David Reyes, who had asked the wrong questions and found himself in a car accident on a road outside the city. He thought about his father 4 months before his death sitting down to write a letter and fold a document inside a folder with no label, tucking it between 2 other files where it would wait until someone came looking. He thought, "I want you to listen." He finally understood. Elena got home at 11:30. She lived in a 3rd-floor walk-up in Queens, a 1-bedroom apartment that she had rented under her own name because she had decided very carefully that trying to hide was the wrong strategy. Hiding made you look guilty. Living openly made you look like someone who had nothing to hide. She had nothing to hide. What she had was a folder in a locked box in the back of her closet, inside a winter coat she hadn't worn since February, in a building that nobody knew she lived in except her employer and the city's rental database. She sat on the edge of her bed. She thought about the conversation. She had spent 6 years and 11 months preparing for it, and now that it was done, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief, not fear, but a kind of forward momentum, like being at the top of a long incline and feeling the first pull of gravity. There was no stopping it now. She had told him enough that if he chose to, he could find her, follow her, pressure her. She had made herself visible in a way she hadn't been since she'd started. She had done it because she believed after 11 months of watching that he was someone who could be trusted with what came next. She hoped she was right. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Silence for a moment. Then a voice she didn't recognize, male, flat, with a precision to the cadence that was not the precision of warmth. "We know you spoke to him tonight," the voice said. "We've been patient because we weren't certain what you had. We're certain now." Elena said nothing. "You have 48 hours to bring us what your grandfather left behind. If you do, this ends cleanly. If you don't..." A pause. "Think about the housing inspector." The line went dead. Elena sat in the silence of her apartment. Her heart was moving fast. She breathed through it. In and out. The way she'd learned to move through fear, not around it, not away from it, but directly through it until it became information instead of noise. Someone had been watching the restaurant tonight. Someone had been watching her for longer than she'd known. Which meant the timeline she thought she had, careful, deliberate, her terms had just collapsed. She picked up her phone. She called the only number she had for him. He answered on the second ring. "They know," she said, a beat of silence. "How long ago?" 2 minutes. "Are you at home?" "Yes." "Don't move." His voice was completely controlled. "I'm sending someone. Do not open the door for anyone until they give you the word Tuesday. Do you understand?" "Yes." Elena. Something in the way he said her name. Not soft, but present. Like he was making sure she heard him through the fear. "I've been doing this a long time. Trust me for the next 30 minutes. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about patience. "Okay," she said. She set the phone down. She sat in the silence. The man who knocked on Elena's door 17 minutes later said Tuesday before she could ask. She opened the door. He was somewhere in his 40s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that didn't invite conversation. He held up a phone with a live video call already running, and on the screen was Damian Romano jacket still on, standing somewhere that wasn't his apartment. "Are you all right?" Damian asked. "Yes." "Good, go with him. Bring whatever you need for 2 days. Don't bring anything you're not willing to lose." Elena looked at the man in the doorway. He was already scanning the hallway behind him, with the automatic efficiency of someone who did this the way other people checked their mirrors while driving. "The document," she said to Damian. "Bring it. If I bring it and something goes wrong, then we make sure nothing goes wrong." A pause. "Elena, I need you to move right now." She moved. She had kept a bag half-packed since she started at Aurelius, because she had always known there might be a night like this one. She grabbed it from the closet shelf, pulled the locked box down from behind the winter coat, pressed her thumb to the combination. The folder was inside, sealed in a waterproof envelope that her grandmother had used the plastic yellowed with age, but still intact. She put it under her arm. She was out the door in 4 minutes. The man she didn't ask his name, and he didn't offer it, walked her down the stairs and out through the building's back entrance into an alley where a car was idling. A second man in the driver's seat. Both of them moving with a coordination that told her they had done this before, that this was not improvised. She got in the back. The car moved. She held the envelope against her chest and watched the city slide past the window and breathed. They drove for 22 minutes before pulling into a parking structure in Midtown. Damien was already there, standing beside another car, Marcus a half step behind him. No other visible security, but Elena had learned enough by now to know that didn't mean it wasn't there. Damien looked at her when she got out. One of those looks that checked everything at once, whether she was hurt, whether she was shaken, whether she was still the same person who had sat across from him 2 hours ago. She was. "You all right?" he asked. "You already asked me that." The first answer was 2 minutes after a threatening phone call. "Still yes," she said. "Though I'd like to know how they knew we met tonight." "So would I." He nodded toward the car behind him. "We're going somewhere I know is clean. After that, we're going to figure out exactly who made that call and how far back they've been watching." She held up the envelope. "Before we go anywhere, I want to know what you're planning to do with this." "Open it," he said. "Understand what we're working with. Decide the next move." "That's not specific enough." He looked at her steadily. "What would specific enough sound like?" "It would sound like you telling me that this doesn't disappear into your files the way it disappeared into your father's," she said. "My grandfather trusted a Romano man once before. It saved his life. It also meant 40 years of exile in a country that wasn't his, because the trust was real, but the solution was incomplete." She met his eyes. "I'm not doing incomplete again." Damien was quiet for a moment. Marcus behind him was looking somewhere else with the focused neutrality of someone determined not to hear a private conversation. "Your grandfather trusted my father, and my father protected him," Damien said. "But my father didn't deal with the source. He moved one man to safety and left the network intact, and the network adjusted and kept moving." His voice was level, but there was something underneath it, not quite anger, something more like the weight of reckoning. "I know. I've been sitting with that for the last 2 hours. And I'm telling you that whatever is in that envelope is not going back into a box," he said. "I don't know exactly what the right move looks like yet, because I haven't seen what we're working with, but I'm telling you my intention, which is to deal with the source." He paused. "The whole source." Elena looked at him. She thought about 11 months of watching a man make decisions. The way he'd cut certain partnerships that confused the people around him. The way he'd walked away from income streams that his father had built, and that everyone assumed he'd maintain. The way he'd looked at Victoria last night across a table and said, "That's enough," in a voice that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with a standard that still meant something to him. "Okay," she said. She handed him the envelope. "That's it all." The place he took her was a brownstone on the east side, 3 floors, the kind of building that looked residential from the outside, and was residential. A real family had lived there once, and someone still kept plants in the window boxes as cover. Inside it was something else. Clean, functional, the kind of space that existed to be useful without being noticed. Damien opened the envelope at a table under good light. Marcus stood at the other end of the room. Elena sat across from Damien and watched his face as he read. The document was 31 pages. Her grandmother had told her she'd read it twice in 40 years, once when Matteo gave it to her, and once the night before she gave it to Elena. "I read it to make sure I understood what I was giving you," she had said. "I didn't need to read it more than that. Some things you only need to know once." Elena had read it 7 times. She had memorized the structure of it, which names appeared, Where which money movements connected, which entities, which signatures appeared on which documents. She had spent 3 years cross-referencing every name against public records, news archives, anything she could access without triggering attention. She watched Damien's eyes move across the pages. She watched the moment page 6 when his jaw tightened. She watched the moment page 11 when he set the page down, picked it up again, set it down a second time. She watched page 19, which she knew was the page with Arthur Caldwell's name, appearing for the 3rd time. This time in direct connection with a decision made by a specific city official, now a federal judge, about a grand jury proceeding that had been quietly disbanded in the spring of 1986. Damien read that page twice. He put it at the bottom of the stack and kept going. When he finished, he squared the pages carefully and set them on the table. He put both hands flat on the table, the same way she had sat across from him at Aurelius, and he was quiet for a long moment. "Page 11, he said. The name in the 3rd paragraph. "Richard Amato," Elena said. "He's been my family's attorney for 22 years. She had not known that. She felt it land in the room between them. "He came on 2 years after my father made him," Damien said. His voice was very controlled. "My father trusted him completely." "I'm sorry," Elena said. "Don't be sorry. Be straight with me." He looked at her. "Did you know?" "No. I knew the name from the document, but I didn't know his current connection to you." Damien nodded once, absorbing. "He would have known the files existed," Marcus said from the other end of the room. He had been listening. "If he was involved in the original network and your father brought him in afterward, he would have spent 22 years making sure they never surfaced," Damien finished. The room held that. "He handled my father's estate," Damien said. "After the funeral, he had access to the archive boxes." He stopped. "He would have looked." "And not found it," Elena said, "because my father was careful enough to hide it in plain sight." Damien looked at the stack of pages. "And because no one expected a granddaughter to walk in 11 months later and start carrying plates." "He's the one who told them," Marcus said. "About tonight, he had to be. No one else with access to that level would have moved this fast." "He's been watching the restaurant?" Elena asked. "Not him personally, but if he had someone watching the building checking periodically whether any new employees fit a profile, and if tonight registered as unusual, he'd have received a report quickly enough to make that call within 2 hours of the meeting ending." Marcus paused. "He's scared. That call wasn't a play from a position of strength. That was someone trying to scare you off before you could move." Elena thought about the voice on the phone, the flatness of it. She had read it as confidence, that practiced performance of power tone. But Marcus was right. Underneath the flatness, there had been something tighter, urgency, pressure. "He doesn't know what I have," she said slowly. "He knows I spoke to Damien. He knows I have something, but he doesn't know if I have the document specifically or just information. Which means," Damien said, "that the 48-hour window he gave you isn't about the document. It's about buying time to figure out how much damage has already been done. And about separating you from me," Elena said. Damien nodded. "If you bring him what he wants, I don't hear what's in it. If you disappear, the document disappears with you." He looked at her. "Either way, he prevents this conversation from going any further." "So we don't give him either option," Marcus said. Damien picked up the stack of pages again. He turned to page 19. He looked at Arthur Caldwell's name for a long time. He thought Elena could see about Victoria. About a dinner where his fiancée humiliated a waitress in front of a room full of people. About the way for years he had told himself the engagement had strategic value. He set the page down. "I need to know," he said without looking at her, "how much of this you believe is still active." "The financial network. All of it. Caldwell, Amato, the structures, the people." Elena thought about David Reyes, a housing inspector in the Bronx asking questions about a real estate development, a car accident on a road outside the city. I believe it never stopped, she said. I believe it adapted when it had to change shape twice, once in the early 90s, once after 2008. But the core network is the same. Different names in some of the seats, same architecture. She paused. I believe David Reyes is proof. And I believe there are others I haven't found yet. Damien was quiet. If I'm right, Elena said, and if that document goes to the right place with the right people behind it, then the network doesn't just lose one case. It loses the foundation. Everything built on top of it for 40 years becomes vulnerable. Which is why Amato has been worried since the moment your grandfather disappeared, Damien said. He spent 4 decades waiting for the other shoe. It's been a long wait, Elena said. It's over now. He said it simply, without drama. The way he said most things quietly, as if the words didn't need decoration to mean what they meant. Marcus straightened. We need a plan that moves before they can, because once they realize the 48 hours didn't work, they'll try something else. I know, Damien said, and we have a problem that I want to name out loud, Marcus continued. Amato is your attorney. He has standing. He has information. If he understands what's happening, if he puts together that Elena has the full document, he will go to Caldwell. And Caldwell will go further than a phone call. Damien looked at him. What level of further are we discussing? Elena asked. Marcus looked at her directly for the first time since they'd arrived. The kind that doesn't leave loose threads. The room was very quiet. Elena thought about her grandfather moving to a country that wasn't his. Her grandmother keeping a folder for 40 years and never once talking about it in a way that could be overheard. The exhausting, specific weight of knowing something dangerous and having nowhere safe to put it. She was not going to end up in exile. She was not going to disappear. Then we move first, she said. We move first, Damien agreed. The plan took 3 hours to build. Not 3 hours of conversation, 3 hours of the particular meticulous work of people who understood that a mistake at this stage would cost everything. Damien made calls she was not present for. Marcus made calls she was not present for. At one point, she sat alone in a room that was not large and was very quiet, and she thought about her grandmother sitting at a kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold. She thought, I understand now. I understand why you waited so long. Because once you move, you cannot stop. Marcus brought her coffee at 2 in the morning. She was surprised enough that she thanked him before she thought about it. He almost smiled. Almost. He trusts you, Marcus said. It was not small talk. It was information delivered the way Marcus delivered everything directly without preamble. That's not common. I know. I've worked with him for 8 years. I can count on one hand the people he trusts without reservation. He put the coffee on the table beside her. I'm not saying it to make you feel good. I'm saying it because it means something about how this is going to go. What does it mean? It means he'll hold, Marcus said. Whatever comes next, pressure, complications, things getting harder than they look right now, he'll hold. You should know that going in. Elena looked at him. You've been worried about the same thing I was, she said. Whether he was someone you could rely on, or someone who would make the calculation at the wrong moment. Marcus said nothing. 8 years, and you're still making the same assessment, she said. It wasn't accusatory, just recognizing the truth of it. Every situation is different, Marcus said, and this situation is unlike anything in 8 years. She picked up the coffee. Thank you, she said again. Marcus went back to the other room. At 3:15, Damien came back. He sat down across from her, and he looked tired in the specific way of someone who had been running calculations for hours and had arrived at an answer he didn't entirely like, but could work with. I need to tell you something, he said. All right. The judge on page 19, the one connected to the grand jury decision in '86. Elena went still. She knew the name. Federal Judge Harold Sinclair, appointed in 1991, currently sitting on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. He's the brother-in-law of the man I was going to use to move the document through proper channels, Damien said. The contact I had in mind, a federal prosecutor I've had a quiet relationship with for 4 years, is married to Sinclair's sister. The connection hit her like cold water. He may have no idea, Damien said quickly. There's nothing in the document that ties him directly. But if Sinclair hears anything before we're ready, through family, through professional channels, through anything, the document gets challenged, the chain of custody gets questioned, and Amato's people have time to build a counter-narrative. So we can't use your contact. Not as the primary move, no. Elena looked at the stack of documents on the table. 31 pages that had been waiting for this moment for 40 years. There's someone else, she said. Damien looked at her. There's a journalist, she said. She's been working on a piece about the Bronx development for 8 months. She started from David Reyes. She knew him. She was already suspicious about the accident. She doesn't know what I have, but she knows something is wrong. Elena met his eyes. If she had the document and she had time to verify it independently, a week, maybe 10 days, she could publish before anyone has a chance to bury it. A journalist, Damien said. He wasn't dismissive. He was working through it. The document goes public. The network loses the ability to quietly suppress it. They can't make a newspaper story disappear the same way they can make an investigation disappear. They can challenge the document's authenticity. They can try, Elena said. But here's the thing, your father's letter references it. The photograph connects your family to Mateo Marquez in a way that's independently verifiable. And I've spent 3 years building a cross-reference of every name in the document against public records. Separate document, separate source. She can verify the financial movements through public records alone. The document just tells her where to look. Damien looked at her steadily. You've been planning this, he said. I've been planning for the possibility that the legal route would be blocked, she said. Because I've been watching what happens when the legal route goes through people with connections to the network. It disappears. It has disappeared twice that I can identify. He was quiet. The journalist route is messier, she said. It's less controlled. Once it's out, and the blowback will be significant, and some of it will land on you. She paused. Your name isn't in the document. But Amato's is, and Amato has been your attorney for 22 years, and that connection will be reported. I know. And Caldwell's relationship to you through the engagement? I know, he said again. He stood up. He walked to the other side of the room and stood there thinking the way she had watched him think across a restaurant for almost a year. That quality of internal stillness that meant everything was moving at speed beneath the surface. I ended things with a family in the Bronx last year, he said without turning around. A partnership that had been in place since my father's time. Real estate city contracts. I ended it because when I looked at where the money came from, I didn't like the answer. He paused. The people I ended it with were not happy. They told me I was walking away from a legacy. Elena waited. I told them I didn't want that legacy, he said. I told them there was a difference between what my father built and what got attached to it along the way. He turned around. I've been trying to separate those two things for 6 years. He stopped. Trying to be the version of this that he intended, not the version other people wanted to make it. He looked at her. That's not a simple thing to do from the inside. No, she said softly. It isn't. Your grandfather trusted my father because my father had a line he wouldn't cross, Damien said. A point at which he would say no regardless of the cost. Mateo recognized it because they were the same kind of man. He came back to the table. He sat down. Call the journalist, he said. Elena exhaled. But we move tonight, he said. Not 10 days. I'll give her 48 hours, and then I want this in motion. She'll need time to verify. I'll give her access to what she needs to verify quickly. I have resources she doesn't. But we are not sitting still for 10 days while Amato is worried, and Caldwell is calculating, and someone is watching the restaurant for movement. Elena nodded. Okay, 48 hours. One more thing. His voice shifted, not softer but more careful. The way you spoke about something that mattered enough to be precise. The journalist will report what's in the document. That will include everything about your grandfather. The disappearance, the network, what was done to your family. She looked at him. It means your family's story becomes public, he said. Your grandfather's name. What happened to him? Your grandmother. A pause. You. I know, Elena said. You've thought about that. I've thought about almost nothing else for 6 years. And she thought about a man in a country that wasn't his own, under a name that wasn't his, living a life reduced to its necessary minimum because the world he'd tried to fix had refused to be fixed. She thought about what it had cost him. She thought about what it had cost her grandmother carrying silence for 40 years, like a stone in her chest. She thought about David Reyes, and a road outside the city, and the knowledge that this particular wheel had kept turning long after the people who set it spinning should have been held to account. My grandfather didn't want protection, she said. He wanted it to stop. He wanted the truth to survive long enough that it couldn't be ignored anymore. She met Damien's eyes. I'm not interested in protecting myself if the cost of protection is more silence. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said something she didn't expect. He would have liked you, he said. My father. The simplicity of it after everything, after the document, and the phone call, and 3 hours in a safe house, and all the weight of what was coming, the simplicity of it hit her somewhere she hadn't braced. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Victoria called at 3:47 in the morning. Damien looked at the phone. He knew in the particular way you knew things you'd been avoiding that the timing was not coincidental. Victoria had never called him at 3:47 in the morning in the entire course of their relationship. He answered. Where are you? She said. Working. At 4 in the morning. Not a question. Something underneath her voice that he hadn't heard before or hadn't let himself hear. There's a situation I'm dealing with, he said. My father called me. A pause. Deliberate. He said you've been asking questions, through different people, about old business. Another pause. He said he's concerned. Damien was very still. He looked at Elena across the table. She had heard the tone of his silence, and she was watching him. Your father and I will talk tomorrow, Damien said. He said you should call him tonight. I'm sure he did. Damien? Something in her voice broke the surface for a moment. Something he might have once called vulnerability, but was reconsidering now. What is happening? Tell me what is happening. I'll call you in the morning, Victoria. My father is... I heard you. He hung up. He looked at the phone for a moment. Then he looked at Marcus, who had appeared in the doorway at some point during the conversation. Caldwell knows we have the document, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. He suspects it. He doesn't know for certain yet. Damien set the phone down. But he'll know by morning, because Victoria will tell him the call didn't go the way he hoped. That changes our window. Yes. 48 hours becomes 24, Damien said. Maybe less. He looked at Elena. She was already pulling out her phone. I'll call the journalist now, she said, at 4 in the morning. A story like this. She met his eyes. She'll answer. God. The journalist's name was Nora Vasquez. She answered on the third ring, her voice already awake, in a way that suggested she either hadn't been asleep or had trained herself to come alert very fast the way people did when their work required it. Who is this? She said. My name is Elena Marquez, Elena said. My grandfather was Mateo Marquez. I have a document that connects the accident that killed David Reyes to a financial network that has been operating in this city for 40 years. I also have the name of a federal judge who helped shut down the 1986 grand jury investigation into that network. And I have a man sitting across from me right now who is willing to give you access to resources that will let you verify all of it within 24 hours. Silence. Then, where are you right now? Somewhere safe. Can you meet me? In 6 hours, Elena said. Bring everything you have on David Reyes and the Bronx development. I have a lot, Nora said. And there was something in her voice, a controlled excitement, the sound of someone who had been sitting with a half-finished picture and was being told the rest of the pieces were on their way. "Good," Elena said. "So do I." She hung up. She set the phone on the table. She looked at Damien. He was watching her with that look again, the one she still didn't have a name for, the one she had first seen when she told him her name across a restaurant table and watched something rearrange behind his eyes. "We have 6 hours," she said. "We have 6 hours," he agreed. "You should know," she said, "that after this it will get harder before it gets easier. The document being public doesn't end things. It starts a different set of things." "I know," he said. "And your engagement, my engagement," he said quietly, "was never what I told myself it was." He paused. "I think I knew that. I just hadn't found the version of myself yet that was willing to say it out loud." The room was quiet. Outside, the city was doing what the city always did: continuous, indifferent, enormous. And inside this room, two people who had approached the same truth from opposite directions were sitting across from each other at 4 in the morning, and the distance between them was much smaller than it had been 11 months ago. "Your grandfather was right," Damien said. "About my father. About what he believed." "I know," Elena said. "I hope he gets to be right about me too." She looked at him, thought about a man she'd barely known. Careful questions over 2 visits a year, a name she'd carried for 6 years, like a compass pointing at something she couldn't yet see. "Ask me again in 24 hours, she said. And for the first time since she had walked into Aurelius 11 months ago and started watching and waiting and learning the weight of patience for the first time, Damien Romano smiled. It was brief, but it was real. 6 hours passed. The way the last hours before something irreversible always passed too fast. In some places, unbearably slow in others, with a quality of heightened awareness that made ordinary things feel significant, and significant things feel almost too large to hold. Damien did not sleep. Elena did not sleep either, though Marcus had shown her a room with a couch and told her to try. She had lain there for 20 minutes in the specific alertness of someone whose body understood that rest was not actually available. And then she had gotten up and gone back to the table, where the document was still sitting 31 pages, that had been waiting 40 years for a night like this one. She read it again, not because she didn't know it, because she needed to feel the weight of it one more time before she handed it to someone else. Her grandfather had assembled this with the kind of patience that took years cross-referencing transactions, obtaining documents through connections. Elena still didn't fully understand, building a picture from pieces that individually meant very little and collectively meant everything. He had done it knowing the risk. He had done it because he believed that the truth, properly documented, properly preserved, had a kind of survival instinct of its own. That if you kept it intact long enough, eventually it would find the light. He had been right. It had just taken longer than he expected. At 6:45, Damien came and found her at the table. He had changed his jacket. His eyes were clear in the specific way of someone who had never relied on sleep to stay sharp. He put a cup of coffee in front of her without asking and sat down. "She's ready," he said. "Nora Vasquez. She's been up all night pulling her files." "Good." Marcus spoke to her assistant. "She wants to meet at 8. Elena nodded. "Before we go," Damien said, "I need to tell you what I've set in motion." She looked at him. "I've been careful about how I've built things in this city," he said. "There are people, not my people directly, but people who have maintained careful distances from me for reasons that become obvious when you know what's in that document, who have been waiting for something like this. Not waiting actively, just positioned." He paused. "When the story publishes, it's going to move fast, and there are going to be people who try to challenge the document before it gains traction. I've made arrangements to make that very difficult for them." "What kind of arrangements?" "The kind that involve 3 independent verifications of the document's provenance already being in the hands of 3 people who have no connection to each other and no reason to coordinate their responses." He met her eyes. "If someone tries to call the document a forgery, 3 separate parties will immediately and independently confirm otherwise. before Caldwell's attorneys can even draft a letter. Elena absorbed that. You did all of this overnight. I did it in 6 hours, he said. I had some infrastructure to work with. She thought about what that meant, the particular kind of power that could move that quickly, with that precision, using connections carefully maintained over years. She thought about how her grandfather had approached Carlo Romano because he recognized a man with that kind of power who still had a line he wouldn't cross. You've been waiting for something like this too, she said. Not accusatory, just recognizing. Damien looked at her steadily. I've been waiting to understand what my father was trying to tell me, with the cuts he made, the partnerships he ended quietly, the decisions that confused everyone around him. He paused. I always knew there was a thread. I just didn't know where it started. Now you do. Now I do. He picked up his coffee cup. There's one more thing, he said. His voice shifted, not colder but more careful. Amato knows something is happening. He doesn't know what yet, but he's been trying to reach me since 6 this morning. 4 calls. Have you answered? No, but I'm going to. Elena looked at him sharply. Not now, he said. After the meeting with Vasquez, after the document is in her hands and the verification chain is in place. Then I'm going to answer. His jaw set slightly. Because when the story breaks, I want him to know it came from me. Specifically from me. I want there to be no ambiguity in his mind about who made this decision and why. That's personal, Elena said. Yes. He didn't apologize for it. 22 years. He sat in my father's house. He handled my father's estate. He has been in rooms with me where I made decisions based on advice that I now understand was designed to keep me from looking in exactly the right places. His voice stayed level, but she could hear what was underneath it now, the particular anger of a man who prided himself on seeing clearly and had just discovered the dimensions of his own blind spot. So yes, it's personal. She didn't argue with that. Some things were allowed to be personal. Nora Vasquez was not what Elena had imagined. She was in her mid-40s, compact, with close-cropped hair and eyes that moved very quickly across everything and rested on nothing for more than a second or two. She had been a journalist for 20 years, the last 12 at a publication with national reach, and she had the specific combination of intelligence and recklessness that produced great reporters and sometimes great disasters. She looked at Elena first, then at Damien, and then she looked at the envelope on the table between them. Before anything else, she said, I want to be clear about what I'm agreeing to and what I'm not. Go ahead, Damien said. I'm agreeing to look at what you have. I'm agreeing to independent verification at my own standard, which is rigorous and not negotiable. I'm agreeing to protect sources to the full extent of my ability and legal protection. She paused. What I am not agreeing to is any editorial control from either of you. No approval rights on the story. No advance look at the final piece. I write what the evidence supports, and I write it completely. Including connections to the Romano family, Damien said. Including everything, Nora said. If you can't live with that, we can live with it, Elena said. Nora looked at her. My grandfather spent 40 years in exile, Elena said. He didn't get to come home. Whatever this story costs, I can absorb it. Nora held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way someone nodded when they'd decided something. She looked at the envelope. Show me, she said. Elena slid the document across the table. Nora opened it. The room was quiet for a long time. Nora read the way serious people read important things slowly, with a stillness that was not passivity, but concentration. She had a legal pad beside her, and she wrote occasional notes in a shorthand that Elena couldn't read from across the table. She turned pages with care. She stopped twice on the same page Elena had seen Damien stop on page 11 and wrote something longer. When she finished the first pass, she looked up. This is real, she said. Yes, Elena said. I mean, I'll verify it. I have to verify it. But this... She tapped the pages. This has the texture of real documentation. The financial movements align with things I've already found independently. The timeline maps. She paused. The name on page 19. Harold Sinclair, Damien said. Nora looked at him steadily. He's currently sitting on the Second Circuit. I know. This is going to be very large, she said. Not excited, something more controlled than that. Aware. The particular awareness of someone who understood that large stories had weight that fell on everyone involved. I know, Damien said again. Your name will be in this story, she said to him directly. Not in the document, but in the story. The relationship between your attorney and the network, your engagement to Caldwell's daughter, it has to be reported. I understand. The engagement, Nora said carefully. Is that still? No, Damien said. Elena looked at him. He was looking at Nora, his expression settled and clear. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, as if the words were sufficient in themselves and didn't need volume to carry weight. No, he said again. That conversation will happen today. Nora held his gaze for a moment, then made a note. I need 20 hours, she said. Not 48, 20. My team is already on the Reyes piece, and I can integrate this into what we have. 20 hours, and it goes to editorial. And then, Elena asked, then it publishes. Nora looked at her. There may be legal challenges before it goes live. I want you to be prepared for that. Caldwell has attorneys who are very good at last-minute injunctions. I have arrangements in place, Damien said, that will make an injunction very difficult to sustain. Nora raised an eyebrow. 3 independent verifications of provenance, he said. Already placed. Accessible the moment anyone challenges authenticity. Nora looked at him for a moment with something that might on a different day have been admiration. You did that overnight. I had infrastructure to work with. Clearly. She gathered the document carefully and placed it in a folder she had brought for it. I want one thing from each of you before we're done. What? Elena asked. Your on-record statement, Nora said, looking at her. About your grandfather. About what happened to your family. About why you did this. She paused. Not for the document speaks for itself. But the story of why this information survived 40 years is part of the story. And I want it told in your words. Elena thought about it for a moment. She thought about what Damien had said the night before, that her family's story would become public, that her grandfather's name would be in it, that the cost of truth was the loss of the privacy that had protected them for decades. She thought about whether that was a cost or a release. Yes, she said. I'll give you the statement. And you, Nora said, looking at Damien. What do you want from me? I want you on record about Amato, Nora said. About your knowledge of the relationship between your attorney and the network, specifically when you became aware of it. I want your account in your words, not inferred from the document. Damien was quiet for a moment. He looked at the folder now holding 31 pages of his father's most careful work. All right, he said. They were on record for 2 hours. Elena spoke first with Nora's recorder running and a second device as backup. She told it clearly and chronologically, her grandmother's kitchen, the envelope, her grandfather's handwriting on a card, 6 years of cross-referencing, 11 months at Aurelius. She told it without drama because the facts had enough of their own. She talked about David Reyes, whose name she had found 3 months ago through a small news item about a traffic accident, and whose connection to the Bronx development she had spent weeks verifying before she understood what it meant. When she talked about her grandfather, her voice stayed even. Nora noticed. She didn't comment on it. When Damien spoke, he was precise in the way of someone who had spent the 6 hours at the table, not sleeping, but preparing, organizing what he knew and when he knew it, making sure the account was accurate and complete. He talked about Amato's role in the estate, the access it had provided, the specific decisions he could now trace back to moments where Amato had redirected his attention. He talked about the engagement in the measured language of someone who had had several hours to reach a private reckoning before being asked to describe it publicly. When Nora asked about Victoria specifically, Damien said, "The engagement was presented to me as a business alliance with personal dimensions. I now understand that it was designed at least in part to give Arthur Caldwell proximity to the Romano organization and its records. Whether Victoria was aware of that design..." He paused. "I genuinely don't know, and I think that uncertainty is important to report accurately." Nora noted it. When the recording stopped, the three of them sat in a quiet that felt different from the one before, like something had been done that couldn't be undone, and the room understood it. 20 hours, Nora said. She stood and picked up the folder. "I want a way to reach each of you directly if something comes up in verification." They exchanged numbers. At the door, Nora paused and looked back at Elena. "Your grandfather," she started. "Yes. He was right to believe it would survive," Nora said. "Whatever it cost him. He was right." Elena did not trust her voice for a moment. She nodded. Nora left. Marcus was waiting outside. He looked at Damien's face and said nothing, which was the correct response to whatever he saw there. They got in the car. For the first few minutes, nobody spoke. The city moved past the windows in its ordinary, continuous way, and the silence inside the car was the silence of people who had done something and were now living in the space between action and consequence. Then Damien said, "Call Amato. Tell him I'm available at noon." Marcus picked up his phone. "And Marcus." Damien's voice was very quiet. "Make sure he understands that noon is the only time I'm available. Not earlier. Noon." Marcus understood what that meant. The timing was deliberate enough. Time for Nora's verification to be well underway, for the chain of custody to be fully established, for the document to be so deeply embedded in the verification process that removing it from play was no longer possible. By noon, the machinery would be running, and Amato calling it off would be like trying to stop a train by standing in the track. "Done," Marcus said. Victoria called at 9:43. Damien answered this time. "My father wants to meet with you," she said, immediately. No greeting. "I have a noon appointment. He wants to come now." "That's not going to work for me, Victoria." A pause. He could hear something in her breathing, a tension she was trying to control. "Damien, my father is very concerned about some things that are..." "I'm sure he is," Damien said. Silence. "What is that supposed to mean?" Victoria said. He thought about what Marcus had said, that it was possible Victoria genuinely didn't know. That the engagement was a structure built around her without her full understanding of its architecture. He thought it was possible. He also thought it was possible she knew more than she'd shown, and that the particular smoothness with which she'd handled him throughout their relationship was not natural ease, but practiced misdirection. He didn't know. He might never know. "Victoria," he said, "I think you know that something is happening, and I think you know it's serious. What I want you to understand is that whatever happens in the next 24 hours, whatever your father tells you about it, whatever framing he puts on it, I need you to ask yourself whether you've ever seen his version of events be the complete version." Silence again. "That's not fair," she said finally. Her voice had changed something underneath the usual control, something younger and less certain. "No," he agreed. "It's not. A lot of this isn't fair, but it's true." "You're ending the engagement," she said. Not a question. Her voice had gone flat in the way of someone who had suspected something and was now hearing confirmation without wanting it. "Yes," he said. The silence that followed was very long. "Because of her," Victoria said. "The waitress." "Because of what's right," Damien said. "She's part of that. But she's not the whole of it." Another pause. "My father said she was dangerous," Victoria said. "He said she was connected to people who wanted to destroy our family." "She's connected to a man who was destroyed by people connected to your family," Damien said. "There's a significant difference." He heard Victoria pull in a breath. "I didn't know," she said. And something about the way she said it, the rawness of it, the absence of performance made him believe her. At least partly. At least enough to be honest with her. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm telling you directly instead of letting you hear it from someone else." "What's going to happen?" "There's going to be a story," he said. "It will publish in the next day or so. It will be about your father and about a financial network and about things that happened a long time ago that have been affecting people ever since." He paused. "It will also mention your name in the context of the engagement. I want you to be prepared for that." "Damien." "Get an attorney," he said. "Not one of your father's attorneys. Someone independent. Do that today." Another silence. "Are you protecting me?" she said. It came out uncertain, surprised. "I'm giving you information," he said. "What you do with it is your choice." He hung up. He sat in the car and looked at the city and thought about the conversation he'd just had. He thought about the version of himself that had proposed to Victoria Caldwell, the version that had told himself the alliance made sense, that personal feeling was secondary to strategic reality, that his father had made similar calculations. He thought about how the stories we tell ourselves to justify choices we haven't fully examined were almost always the most expensive stories we told. The car moved through traffic. Elena was in the seat beside him, quiet, having heard one side of the conversation. She didn't ask him to replay it. She just sat there close enough that he was aware of her presence and said nothing and let him be inside the moment without requiring him to explain it. He appreciated that more than he had words for. Richard Amato arrived at noon with a composed expression that cost him visible effort. He was 61, silver-haired, with the polished bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades being the most controlled person in every room he entered. He had been doing this long enough that he was good at it, good enough that until 14 hours ago, Damien had never had reason to look past the surface. Now he looked at Amato across the table in the same brownstone where Elena had sat with Nora Vasquez 4 hours earlier, and he saw something different. Not a trusted attorney, a man who was calculating. "You look tired," Amato said. He sat down without being invited, which he'd always done, which Damien had always read as familiarity, and was reading differently now. "Richard," Damien said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I want a direct answer." Amato's expression shifted slightly. Just slightly. "Of course. Did you look through my father's archive files after the funeral?" A pause. Brief but real. "I reviewed the estate materials as part of my duties. Yes. As you know, I handled—" "I'm not asking about estate materials," Damien said. "I'm asking about the archive boxes. The ones in the West Side storage unit. The ones with files going back to the 80s. Another pause. Longer. "I reviewed what was relevant to the estate," Amato said. His voice was steady, but he had stopped meeting Damien's eyes with the same directness. A millimeter of difference. "Enough." "You didn't find what you were looking for," Damien said. Amato said nothing. "I have it," Damien said. The room changed. It didn't change loudly. Amato didn't stand or raise his voice or do anything dramatic. He sat very still, the way Damien went still, when something required maximum control, and his face settled into an expression that was beyond the composed surface. Something older, something that looked for just a moment like a man who had been running from something for 40 years and had just felt it catch up. "Damien," he said. "Whatever you think you have, I know what I have," Damien said. "I read it last night, all 31 pages." Amato's hands, flat on the table, tightened slightly. "I also know what you did," Damien continued. "In 1986, the grand jury, the investigation, the specific recommendations made through your connections to Harold Sinclair that resulted in the proceeding being dissolved before it could be completed." He paused. "And I know about Mateo Marquez and what happened to him and why." Amato was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father was protecting something larger. The network, the relationships it maintained, kept this city functioning in ways that—" "Don't," Damien said. The word came out quietly, but Amato stopped. Do not tell me my father believed in what you were protecting, Damien said. Because I have a letter in his handwriting that tells me exactly what he believed, and it is not what you are about to say. Amato looked at him. For the first time in 22 years, the older man looked genuinely uncertain, like the ground he'd always trusted had shifted, and he couldn't locate solid footing. The document is already in verification, Damien said. It will publish within the next 20 hours. There is nothing you can do to stop that. Any legal challenge to authenticity will be defeated by 3 independent verifications already in place. He paused. I am not telling you this to threaten you. I am telling you because you deserve to know that it is over, and because I want you to understand that I made this decision deliberately and completely with full knowledge of what it means. Amato said nothing for a long time. You're ending this, Amato said finally. Everything your father built. My father didn't build this, Damien said. My father built something else, and this got attached to it, and he spent the last 20 years of his life trying to separate the two without destroying either. He didn't get there. He paused. I'm going to get there. You don't understand the exposure, Amato said. His voice had changed. The composure was thinner now. If that document becomes public, the connections to your organization will be drawn regardless of... I know, Damien said. I'm prepared for that. Are you prepared for what, Richard? Damien's voice was very quiet. I'm asking you to leave now. Amato looked at him. He looked at him for a long moment with an expression Damien couldn't fully categorize. Something that might have been regret, or might have been the performance of regret from a man who had made his peace with what he'd done decades ago, and was only sorry now that it had finally arrived. He stood. He straightened his jacket. Your father would not have done this, he said. My father, Damien said, spent the last months of his life writing a letter explaining exactly why he wished he had. Amato left. Marcus came in from the other room. He had heard everything, which was the point. It was why Damien had chosen this space not for privacy, but for witnesses he trusted. That's done, Marcus said. That's done, Damien agreed. How do you feel? Damien thought about it honestly. Like something heavy has been set down, he said. And like whatever comes next is going to require everything. It will, Marcus said. I know. Marcus paused at the door. Elena is in the other room. She was there for the end of it. Damien looked at him. She heard what you said to Amato, Marcus said. About your father's letter, about getting there. He paused. She didn't say anything, but I thought you should know she was there. Damien nodded once. Marcus left. Damien sat for a moment. He thought about choices made in full knowledge of their cost. He thought about a man who had sat across from his son at 24 and said, I want you to listen, knowing that the complete lesson would take longer than he had left to teach it. He thought about patience as a form of love, not the absence of action, but the decision to wait for the right moment to preserve something fragile until the person who could do something with it was ready. He thought his father had been waiting a long time for him to be ready. He was ready now. He stood. He went to the other room where Elena was sitting at the table with her hands in her lap, looking at nothing specific in the posture of someone who had just witnessed something significant and was still in the process of deciding what it meant. She looked up when he came in. You heard, he said. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to. It's all right. He sat down across from her. I meant what I said. I want you to know that, not because you were listening, because it's true. She held his gaze. He was wrong about one thing, Elena said quietly. Amato. He said your father wouldn't have done this. She paused. I think your father spent the last months of his life hoping you would. Damien looked at her. The room was very quiet. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, enormous and continuous, and indifferent to the individual weight of individual moments. Inside, something had settled. Not finished. There was nothing finished about this. There was still everything to come. The publication, the fallout. The long work of what came after the truth arrived. But something had settled, like the difference between carrying a weight and knowing where it was going to be put down. 17 hours, Damien said. 17 hours. Elena agreed. She looked at him steadily. Whatever happens, she said, my grandfather was right to leave that note about the Romano family. He looked at her. He was right about your father, she said, and he was right that the truth would survive. A pause. He just didn't know it would take 40 years, and his granddaughter pretending to be a waitress. Something moved across Damien's face. Not quite a smile. Something more than that. She wasn't pretending, he said. Elena raised an eyebrow. She was the best server we had, he said. I asked the kitchen. She looked at him for a moment, and then for the first time in 11 months of careful stillness, Elena Marquez laughed. It was brief, and it was real, and it changed the texture of everything in the room. Damien Romano looked at her and thought whatever the next 17 hours bring this moment existed. That was enough. For now, it was enough. The story published at 6:43 in the morning. Elena knew the exact moment it went live because her phone began to move, not ring, not buzz once, but sustain a continuous low vibration that didn't stop, like a frequency that had been waiting to be activated and was finally running at full power. She was already awake. She had been awake since 4, sitting at the table in the brownstone that had become, over the last 24 hours, a kind of operational center for something she still didn't have a complete name for. She had her coffee. She had the silence of a city in the last hour before it fully woke. And she had the particular interior stillness of someone who had made every decision they were going to make and was now simply waiting for the world to catch up. Damien was awake too. He came into the room at 6:50, already dressed, phone in hand. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was nothing to say that the moment didn't already contain. Then he said, "It's out." "I know," she said. He sat down across from her and set his phone on the table between them. The screen showed the headline. It was not a small headline. Nora Vasquez had spent 20 hours working, and it showed the piece was thorough, meticulously sourced, and the headline was the kind that landed with physical weight. 40 years of silence. How a hidden financial network corrupted city government, buried a federal investigation, and destroyed one man's life, and why it's still operating today. Below the headline, in a smaller font, by Nora Vasquez. With documentation provided by Elena Marquez, granddaughter of whistleblower Mateo Marquez. Elena looked at her grandfather's name in print for the first time. She had imagined this moment many times over 6 years. She had imagined it would feel triumphant or cathartic, or perhaps frightening. She had not imagined it would feel like this, quiet and large at the same time, like standing at the edge of something, and understanding for the first time how far the view actually went. "You all right?" Damien asked. "Yes," she said. "It's strange seeing his name like that, after so long." Good strange or bad strange? She thought about it honestly. Like something that was always true finally being said out loud, she said. Like the difference between knowing a thing and the world knowing it. Damien nodded. His phone rang. He looked at the screen and declined it without answering. It rang again. He declined again. A third time. "Who?" Elena asked. "Two of them are attorneys I don't recognize, which means Caldwell's people are already moving." He declined a fourth call. "One is from a number I know, a contact at the DA's office." "Is that good or bad?" "Unclear yet." He set the phone down. "Marcus is outside. He's been monitoring since 5:30. He looked at her steadily. "In the next several hours, this is going to get loud. I want you to know that whatever comes in, whatever pressure arrives from whatever direction, I'm not moving." She looked at him. "I'm saying it now," he said, "while it's still quiet, so you have it on record before the noise starts." "I believe you," she said. "Good." He picked up his coffee. "Because you're about to see a significant amount of noise." He was not wrong. By 8 in the morning, the story had been picked up by 4 national outlets. By 9, it was the top trending topic across every major platform. By 9:30, a federal judge, not Harold Sinclair, a different judge, had received an emergency petition from attorneys representing Arthur Caldwell and Richard Amato, seeking an injunction against further publication and requesting the original document be surrendered to the court. The injunction was denied within 40 minutes, because within 40 minutes, the 3 independent verifications Damien had placed overnight had been publicly submitted to the court's electronic filing system by 3 separate parties with no visible connection to each other. The document's provenance was established before the ink on the petition was dry. Elena was in the room when Marcus delivered that news. She felt something release in her chest, a tension she had been carrying so long she'd stopped registering it as separate from herself. It felt like setting down a bag she'd been holding for 6 years. The physical sensation of it was so specific that she had to look down at her hands to confirm they were empty. They were. Marcus noticed. He said nothing. He had gotten better over the last 30 hours at being present without intruding, which Elena had come to understand was one of his genuine skills. "It held," she said. "It held." Marcus agreed. The phone on the table rang again. This time Damien answered. He listened for approximately 90 seconds. His face did not change expression during that time. He said, "I understand," and "yes," and "I'll be available at 2," and then he hung up. He looked at Elena. "That was the U.S. Attorney's office," he said. The room went very still. "They want to meet," he said. "They have questions about the document, and they want to begin a formal investigation." He paused. "They also want to speak with you." Elena held his gaze. "When?" 2 o'clock. "Today." Today. She absorbed that. 40 years. Her grandfather had tried to bring this to the right people in 1986 and had watched every door close. And now, less than 3 hours after Nora Vasquez's story went live, the people with the actual authority to do something were on the phone asking for a 2 o'clock meeting. "That's fast," she said. "They've been handed a documented case with independent verification and a published story with national reach," Damien said. "Not moving fast at this point would be a political liability." He paused. "Which is not the ideal reason for justice to move, but it moves." "It moves," Elena said. At 10:45, Victoria Caldwell called Damien's phone. He was across the room when it rang, and he looked at the screen, and he looked at Elena, and Elena looked back at him and said nothing, because it was not her call to make. He answered. "Did you know?" Victoria said. No greeting, just that. Her voice was different from any version Elena had heard before, not the controlled performance of a woman who always knew what room she was in, but something raw and young and frightened underneath. "Not everything," Damien said. "I found out most of it in the last 48 hours. My father—" She stopped, started again. "My father called me this morning. Before the story went live. He told me there had been a misunderstanding. He told me you'd been misled by someone who wanted to hurt our family." "What did you tell him?" A long pause. "I told him I'd called an attorney." Another pause. "He was not happy about that." "Good," Damien said. "The attorney was the right move." "Damien." Her voice cracked slightly on his name, just slightly, just enough to be real. "Is my father going to be arrested?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know exactly what the legal process looks like from here," he said honestly. "There's a federal investigation opening. The document covers conduct going back 40 years, but there are connections to recent events, a man named David Reyes, that bring it into current territory." He paused. "You should talk to your attorney about what that means for your family." "You're not going to protect him," Victoria said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a realization arriving in real time. "No," Damien said. Silence. "I understand," she said finally. Her voice had gone quieter, younger, like the version of her that existed before all the armor was assembled. I want you to know I don't know how much my mother knew. I don't think she knew the dimensions of it. And She stopped. I told myself the engagement made sense because I thought you were someone I understood. I thought I understood the shape of things. We both got some things wrong, Damien said. You got less wrong than I did, she said. Your attorney, my father, me. There are a lot of people in your life right now who were not what they appeared to be. Some of them, Damien said carefully, may not have fully known what they were part of. That distinction matters. Another pause, then very quietly. Thank you for telling me to get an attorney. You didn't have to. I know, he said. Take care of yourself, Victoria. He hung up. He stood in the quiet for a moment. Elena said from across the room. She didn't know. I think she didn't know all of it, Damien said. Some of it, the alliance, the access she was supposed to provide. I think on some level she understood there were reasons for the relationship that weren't entirely personal. He paused. But the network, the depth of it, what her father was actually protecting, I think that was above what she was told. Does that change anything? He thought about it. It changes how I think about her. It doesn't change what's right. Elena nodded. That was, she thought, exactly the correct answer. At noon, something happened that neither of them had anticipated. Nora Vasquez called. There's a development, she said when Damien put her on speaker. I received a call this morning from a man named Joseph Carlin. He's 74 years old. He was a junior investigator on the 1986 grand jury proceeding. Elena sat up straighter. He read the story this morning, Nora continued. He's been living in Florida for 30 years. He said he tried to continue the investigation independently after the grand jury was dissolved. He said he hit walls everywhere he turned, and eventually, for his own safety, he stopped. A pause. He has his own documentation, separate from the Marquez document. His personal notes and records from the investigation. He's been holding them since 1986. The room was silent. He wants to submit them, Nora said, to the federal investigation. He said he's been waiting for something to break it open enough that his records wouldn't just disappear again. Elena felt the weight of it. A 74-year-old man in Florida holding documents for 30 years, waiting for the same thing her grandmother had waited for, the moment when the truth had enough momentum that it couldn't be stopped. They had all been waiting in their separate silences. They were all arriving at the same moment. Tell him to call the U.S. Attorney's Office directly, Damien said. We have a contact there. I'll make sure someone is expecting his call. I told him that, Nora said. He wants one other thing. What? He wants to know if Elena Marquez is all right, Nora said. He said he never met her grandfather, but he knew who Mateo Marquez was. He said Mateo was the person who actually put the document together, that what Carlin had was the investigative version, but the financial record your grandfather created was the source material. Without it, Carlin's records were circumstantial. A pause. He said he's been thinking about the Marquez family for 30 years. He just wants to know if she's all right. Elena looked at the phone. She thought about a man she'd never met keeping records in a house in Florida, reading the news every morning, waiting. She thought about her grandfather, in a country that wasn't his own, careful and patient, preserving something fragile, because he believed it would matter to someone someday. She thought about the particular loneliness of carrying truth that nobody around you can acknowledge. Tell him? She said, her voice steady, even though something behind her sternum was not entirely steady. That she is more than all right. Tell him that her grandfather would have wanted to shake his hand. And tell him... She paused. Tell him it's over now. He can let it go. Nora was quiet for a moment. I'll tell him, she said softly. The 2:00 meeting at the U.S. Attorney's Office lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Elena sat at a conference table with 2 federal prosecutors, a deputy U.S. attorney, and a woman from the Financial Crimes Unit who had clearly read the story twice before the meeting started and arrived with pages of notes. Damien was there, His own attorney, a woman he had retained that morning, someone with no connection to Amato and no connection to the network, was there. Elena answered every question directly and completely. She walked them through the document page by page, cross-referencing her own 6 years of independent verification work, which she had brought on a laptop. She explained her methodology. She explained the chain of custody her grandmother, to her preserved intact, the waterproof envelope, the locked box. She answered questions about the gaps in the timeline. She answered questions about David Reyes and how she'd connected his accident to the network. At one point, one of the federal prosecutors, a woman in her early 40s, who had been listening with great attention, looked at Elena and said, "Ms. Marquez, you conducted this investigation independently, over 6 years, without any institutional support, without a legal team, without subpoena power." "That's correct," Elena said. "How did you know you had enough to bring this forward?" Elena thought about it for a moment. "I didn't," she said honestly. "I had enough to make a decision. Enough is different from certain. My grandfather had more than enough in 1986, and it still wasn't enough to prevent what happened to him." She paused. "I decided the risk of waiting longer was worse than the risk of moving with what I had. And I decided that if I was going to take that risk, I wanted to take it with someone who could make it mean something." She glanced at Damien briefly. "It turns out that part mattered more than I expected." The prosecutor looked between Elena and Damien. She did not comment on what she saw. She made a note. They walked out at 5:40 in the afternoon. The city was doing its late afternoon thing, that particular density of movement that happened when the workday was releasing its pressure and people spilled out into the streets in all directions simultaneously. Elena stood on the steps for a moment, just breathing it. Damien came and stood beside her. They didn't say anything for a while. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "Like I've been holding a door closed for 6 years," she said. "And I just let go of it." She paused. "I don't know what's on the other side yet, but I know the door is open." He looked at her. The afternoon moved around them, loud, continuous, indifferent, in the specific way that New York was indifferent, which was to say, not personal but all-encompassing. "What happens next?" she asked. "For you." "The investigation runs," he said. "That's going to involve my organization in ways that are complicated. There will be questions about my father and about what he knew and when. I'll have to answer them." He paused. "I'll also have to rebuild some things. Relationship structures. A legal team that I actually trust." He looked at the city. "There are partners I've maintained out of inertia or history that I should have ended years ago. This accelerates that work." "That's a lot of hard work," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." He paused. "What about you?" She thought about it. 11 months at Aurelius carrying plates and refilling glasses and waiting for the right moment. Before that, 6 years of building a picture from pieces. Before that, a kitchen table in New Jersey and a cup of tea going cold, and her grandmother's careful voice explaining a truth that had been kept in the dark for decades. She thought about what came after the truth. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I've been moving toward this for so long that I haven't spent much time thinking about what the other side looks like." "What do you want it to look like?" She considered. "Something I built," she said. "Not something I inherited, not something I'm caretaking for someone else. Something I built from my own choices." She paused. "Maybe something that helps other people do what I did, the verification work, the documentation. There are other Mateo Marquezes out there, other Joseph Carlins with boxes of records waiting for something to break open enough to matter." She looked at him. "They need infrastructure." "That's an idea," he said. "It's the beginning of one," she said. "I know someone who might be interested in supporting that kind of beginning," Damien said. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not looking for a patron," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not offering to be one." A pause. "I'm suggesting a conversation about what that beginning might look like and whether the version you're imagining aligns with something I've been thinking about." He held her gaze. "A conversation. not a decision. She looked at him. She thought about the first time she'd met his eyes across a restaurant. She'd been carrying a plate, and he'd been looking at her like she was something he couldn't categorize, and how much had changed between that moment and this one. She thought about the distance she'd covered. She thought about the distance still ahead. "All right," she said. "A conversation." Sad. 3 weeks later, the federal indictment of Arthur Caldwell was announced. Richard Amato, who had retained his own attorney the afternoon of his meeting with Damien, was named as a co-conspirator in connection with the 1986 grand jury proceeding. Harold Sinclair announced his retirement from the Second Circuit before the week was out. 2 other names from the document men in their late 60s and early 70s, who had spent decades inside institutions they had helped to corrupt, were also named. The city reacted the way cities reacted to large truths loudly, and with a combination of shock and the specific resignation of people who had suspected something was wrong and were not entirely surprised to be confirmed right. Joseph Carlin gave his records to the federal investigation. He also gave an interview to Nora Vasquez, sitting in the house in Florida, where he had kept his boxes for 30 years. He was 74, and he spoke carefully and clearly about a proceeding that had been killed before it could breathe, about the specific loneliness of knowing something that no one around you could act on, about the morning he'd read Nora's story and felt something in his chest loosen that he hadn't known was tight. He talked about Mateo Marquez. He said, "That man put the foundation in place. Everything else, what I had, what his granddaughter found, what eventually came out, all of it rested on what he built. He just never got to see it matter." Nora asked, "Do you think it matters now?" Joseph Carlin thought about it for a moment. "A housing inspector in the Bronx is dead," he said. "Some things can't be undone. But the wheel that killed him, that wheel is stopped now, and stopping it is the only justice available." He paused. "It matters. It's late and it's incomplete, and it matters." Elena read the interview the morning it was published. She read it twice. She did not cry, which surprised her. She had cried in private once a few days earlier, not dramatically, just the quiet release of something that had been held for too long finally being allowed to move. But reading Carlin's words about her grandfather, she felt something different. She felt clear. She felt like someone who had finished something important and was standing on the other side of it in open space with the full and simple understanding that what she did next was entirely her own to choose. The conversation Damien had mentioned turned out to be more than one. They met 4 times over the following 2 weeks. Always at a table, always with coffee, always with a specificity of purpose that meant neither of them confused the meetings with something they weren't. They talked about the idea she'd articulated on the steps of the federal building infrastructure for people doing what she had done: documentation work, verification, support, the particular expertise required to build a case from pieces when institutions were too compromised or too cautious to help. Damien listened in the way she had watched him listen for almost a year, with real attention, without interrupting, asking questions that revealed he had tracked everything she'd said and was building on it, rather than waiting for his turn. After the 4th meeting, he said, "I want to fund it." She looked at him. "Not as a patron," he said immediately. "As a partner. There's a difference. A patron writes a check and has opinions. A partner brings something to the table." He paused. "What I bring is access to certain kinds of networks and the specific expertise of someone who has spent 6 years trying to clean up structures that other people built without integrity. I understand the architecture of these things. I understand where the weak points are." He met her eyes. "And I understand now more than ever the value of having someone in the room who doesn't owe anything to anyone." She thought about it. "There would have to be terms," she said. "Obviously. Real terms, in writing, not a handshake. I would expect nothing less from someone who spent 6 years building evidentiary documentation," he said. She almost smiled. "And it operates independently," she said. "Whatever I build. You don't have editorial authority over its work." "Agreed. And if I discover something that touches you or your organization, or anyone connected to either, you report it," he said. He said it simply, without hesitation. The way he said things that were not negotiable because they had already been decided at some internal level. That's not even a question. If that happens, you report it. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about what it meant to trust someone. Not the sentimental version, not trust as a feeling, not trust as a kind of willingness to believe. The real version. The version where you'd watched someone in conditions that revealed character, rather than just performed it, where you'd seen what they did when the cost was real, and the choice was genuinely hard, where you had evidence rather than hope. She had evidence, 11 months of it, and then 3 weeks of the most significant kind. All right, she said. 6 months after the story published, Elena returned to Aurelius for the first time. She did not go as a customer exactly. She went because Marcus had told her that some of the staff had been asking about her, and because Miguel from the kitchen had sent a message through a third party that was so carefully indirect that it had made her laugh out loud, and because she understood that sometimes you needed to return to a place to understand the distance you'd traveled from it. She walked in at 7 on a Friday evening. The maitre d', the same man who had 11 months ago told her to begin the closing checklist and watched her move through the room with the neutrality of someone who had decided not to get involved, saw her first. He stopped what he was doing. He looked at her for a moment. Then he did something she didn't expect. He came around from behind the host stand and he extended his hand and he said, "Ms. Marquez, it's good to see you." Not the careful managed greeting of a maitre d' to a known customer. Something more personal than that. The acknowledgement of a person to another person who had done something in this room that he had been close enough to witness. She shook his hand. "Thank you," she said. Miguel appeared from the kitchen, which meant someone had called ahead. He looked exactly the same as he always had. Same expression, same bearing, the particular immunity of someone who had seen enough to maintain his equilibrium through almost anything. He looked at her and he said, "You could have warned us." "I couldn't," she said. "I'm sorry." He shook his head, but not in the way of someone who was actually upset. 6 years to plan it, 11 months to execute it, and not one person in this building had any idea. "That was the point," she said. "I know." He looked at her steadily. "Good point." He held out his hand. She shook it. Then from across the restaurant, she heard a sound that she recognized, but hadn't expected the particular sound of a room shifting its attention. The subtle collective movement of people becoming aware of something and orienting toward it. She looked up. The room was not staring. It was not dramatic in the way of movie scenes, where all eyes turn at once and the music swells. It was quieter than that, and more real. A few people who had recognized her from Nora's story, a few who had followed the news, a few who simply responded to the quality of attention that the maitre d' and Miguel had shown and understood it to mean something. One woman at a table near the window stood up. She was in her 60s, well-dressed with the bearing of someone who had been making her own decisions for a long time. She looked at Elena for a moment, and then she simply nodded, a small gesture, a deliberate one, the kind that meant, "I see you," rather than "I know you." Slowly, a few other people rose. Not all of them, not every table, but enough that it changed the quality of the room. Elena stood in that change and let it be what it was. She thought about Victoria Caldwell standing in this same restaurant, pushing a plate back across a table and asking whether she knew her place. She knew her place. It was here, and it was the federal building, and it was the table where she'd sat with Damien and a journalist and a stack of 31 pages that had survived 40 years of fear. It was the idea she was building the infrastructure that didn't exist yet, but would the work of people who needed to be able to document the truth without disappearing in the process. Her place was wherever she decided to stand. Damien was already at the corner table when she reached it. He stood when she arrived, a small gesture automatic that she had watched him extend to very few people. He waited until she sat before he sat. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Strange," she said. "And right, which I've come to understand usually means you're in the correct place." He almost smiled. "The attorneys finalized the paperwork today," he said. "The foundation is officially incorporated. You have signing authority and full independence." He paused. "I want you to know that means what it says." "I know," she said. "And I want you to know." He stopped. Started again, which was unusual for him. Damian Romano did not usually stop and start. He thought until he was ready, and then he spoke. The fact that he was doing it now meant something. "I want you to know that whatever happens next with the investigation, with the organization, with all of it, I don't expect anything from this arrangement except the work." She looked at him. "I'm saying that," he said, "because I want you to be able to walk into every meeting and every decision without calculating what it costs you if I'm unhappy with the outcome." He held her gaze. "I don't need you to be careful around me. I need you to be exactly what you are." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her grandfather, who had trusted a man because he recognized in him the specific quality of someone who had decided not to use their power in every direction available to them. Who had understood that restraint in a person with genuine power was not weakness, but a form of integrity that was rarer than any other kind. She thought about Damien at 38, sitting across from her in a restaurant where everything had begun, and choosing deliberately out loud, where she could hear it, to define the shape of what he wanted to be. "You know," she said, "my grandfather sat across from your father once at the beginning of all this, and your father made him a promise." "I know," Damien said. "Your father kept that promise," she said. "He kept it imperfectly, and it cost my family a great deal, but he kept the essential part of it." "I know that too." "I'm not asking you to be your father," she said. "I'm asking you to be what your father was trying to become in the last years of his life." She paused. "I think you already are, but I want to say it out loud." Damien was very still. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. She picked up the menu, not because she didn't know what was on it, but because old habits were comfortable things, and then she set it back down and looked at him across the table. "You know what I want," she said. "Tell me." "I want the best thing on the menu," she said, "and I want to eat it without calculating anything." Something moved through Damian Romano's expression. Something she could read now, after all the time she'd spent watching him from every distance. And it was the particular ease of a man who had been doing very hard things for a very long time, and had just remembered what it felt like when things were simply good. "That," he said, "I can arrange." The world did not stop being complicated because the truth had arrived. Investigations took time. Courts moved slowly. The people named in the document retained powerful attorneys who filed motions and challenged procedures and did everything available to them to slow what was coming. But it was coming. And Elena understood, in the way you understood things, you had earned the understanding of that coming was enough. Moving was enough. The wheel that had killed David Reyes and exiled Mateo Marquez and buried Joseph Carlin's records in a house in Florida for 30 years was stopped, and the people who had kept it turning were answering for it, and the truth that had survived 4 decades of silence was so thoroughly in the light now that no single action could pull it back. Some things could not be undone. But some things once done could not be undone either. That was what her grandfather had understood. Not that truth made everything right again. He knew better than anyone that it didn't, that there were costs that couldn't be recovered, that justice was never as complete as the word implied. But that truth, once it broke the surface, had a life of its own, that it changed the shape of what was possible, that it meant something to the people who came after, even when the people who had carried it were no longer there to see it matter. He had kept the document because he believed someone would need it. He had been right. He had written a note that said, "Find the Romano family," because he believed there was still something there worth finding. He had been right about that too. Elena sat at the corner table at Aurelius on a Friday evening in the city where everything had happened, and she thought about a man she had barely known, who had shaped everything about who she was, and she thought he would have sat exactly like this, straight-backed, clear-eyed, not performing anything, just present, Just exactly himself in a world that had tried very hard and for a very long time to make him into something smaller and had failed. She was his granddaughter. She had come here to find the truth, and she had found it, and she had made it matter, and she had done it without disappearing. And in the restaurant where a woman had once pushed a plate across a table and told her she didn't belong, Elena Marquez sat at the best table in the room and knew with the complete and unshakable certainty of someone who had earned every inch of the ground they stood on exactly where she belonged. She belonged wherever the truth needed someone to carry it, and she was never going to stop.